Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is completely self-funded, produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. Consider making a small donation to support the podcast. Go to bit.ly/support, capital G, capital T, and podcast. I repeat, bit.ly/supportgt podcast. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit Natalie's website, join the podcast Instagram page, and subscribe to the newsletter to receive updates on future episodes. I'm so glad that my next two guests on the podcast are men. Both are speaking about father loss, and both have created purpose-driven businesses after those losses, supporting others. Reid experienced the loss of his father, who died from suicide. Having experienced the loss of a significant male person in his life, Reid thought that he knew how to handle this grief when a few years later his stepfather died from cancer. But he had to experience it all again in a new and unexpected way. Why did he experience those two losses so differently? Find out from Reid telling his story. As this week's podcast gift, Reid offers one of the meditations that can also be received through his Grief Refuge app. Go to the podcast gift page on my website and enter the number of the episode in a word, and you will receive this gift now. About this week's guest, Reid Peterson is a grief companion and educator whose mission is to help people find peace and purpose after loss. He is the founder of Grief Refuge and the creator of the Grief Refuge app. I hope you enjoy today's episode. So welcome, Reid. It's so nice to have you on the podcast.
Thank you, Natalie. I look forward to our conversation.
How are you today?
I am stiff. I am anxious, and I'm a little sad.
And for those people who are new listeners, I ask this question all the time, and I just said to Reid before we started recording, this is the question that leads into the next question and what the podcast is really about. And so it's a way for all of us to tune into how do we feel about the topic, talking about how we're dealing with our grief and loss. So why don't we start with you telling the listener a little bit about how grief and loss has shaped your life?
It's shaped my life more than I ever expected, to be honest. When I was in graduate school back in 2006, I was in a very intense transformational program. I was learning psychology and was learning a type of psychology that I jokingly refer to as the cheater's version of reaching the mountaintop. It's called transpersonal psychology. And a lot of transpersonal psychologists, look at the studies of heightened states of consciousness through the help of drugs. And then also Eastern practices such as meditations and dancing, ecstatic dancing, etc. So it's a very unique type of psychology I was studying. And during that time in my first year, where the program was specifically focused on personal transformation, in the spring, I got a very unexpected phone call from my brother. And I was 2,000 miles away from where I grew up, and to this day, I remember the voicemail, and it said, "Reid, there's been a death in the family. Our dad has died." And when I stopped listening to the message, I actually didn't know what to do with myself. So much emotion hit me so hard that I said to myself, well, I didn't say to myself, I said out loud, I looked up at the sky where I was. I was in the backyard of the home where I was staying, looked up the sky, and as if I was talking to my dad, I said, you finally did it, you son of a bitch. And what I meant by that was that he finally took his life, because as a sensitive and conscientious young adult, I could tell that my dad was living a life of suffering. And so there was so much anticipatory grief that I wouldn't have been able to name back then in regards to what is he going to do and when is he going to do it. And so after years and years of that being stored in the back of my mind, the event finally happened. My dad did die. He took his life, and I said, "You finally did it." And so that brought on, logistical things to happen, returning back to where I grew up and planning for arrangements and dealing with his possessions. And what was really interesting, Natalie, was at first, I actually felt tremendous relief because as someone who cared deeply for my dad and loved him, and yet handled all the complications and the intricacies and issues in our dynamics of our relationship, I just felt like a weight was lifted off my shoulders. And so, I mean, I even shocked some of my family members because I looked very joyful. And after that settled some, then for quite a few years, I recognized and processed guilt-related grief for quite a long time. And life carried on, and I learned to live forward. And then, unfortunately, in 2008, my stepfather was diagnosed with cancer, and he battled it for 8 years. And in 2016, he died. And after he died, I thought I was just going to be great because I had been there before. I lost my dad. I knew how to handle this. But boy, I couldn't have been more wrong as far as thinking that grief, if it's experienced one way, it would be experienced the same way in a future event. And when Warren, my stepfather, died, boy, did sadness just hit me like a tidal wave. And that really was hard. And I've always found myself being a highly sensitive person and also an introvert, to value being in nature as far as grieving, processing grief, and feeling healing in my life. And fortunately, at that time when Warren died, I was living on the West Coast of the United States and was able to spend time at the ocean. And I would just sit there for hours, and I would just stare out into the ocean and almost like feel like nothing was happening, but at the same time, so much. Like, if I can speak to energy, it felt like so much was happening energetically. I wasn't talking, I wasn't moving, I was just being. And in that being, I was recognizing that perhaps my feelings were running their course without me trying to manage or control them. And I did that for quite a long time. I don't have a calendar date on as far as how long I would do that. But I got to a point where I was like, okay, I'm starting to feel some sense of relief in my own grief. And, as being an active supporter to family members, my mom specifically, because she lost her soulmate, and then started feeling a calling kind of grow inside of me. And that led me to, starting an online community and offering services and other things to help other people that are struggling with their grief journeys. So that's, I guess, the recap of the background for me and how I came to be where I am today.
Well, thank you for sharing it, and also with the succession of those different grief points or losses in your life, there's a couple of things that I'd like to go back to just to get the story straight for people and for myself. You mentioned your father died, you were in your 20s, early 20s, if I'm right. And then you said your stepfather. So how many years was between those two losses?
11 years.
11 years.
Yeah.
And why do you think that people think, or why is this idea of, or what I think is like, when you've experienced loss and another loss comes along, then you know how to do it. And so there's this premises. I think it's like, well, I've done grief before, so I know what's coming. And then it's different. But in your specific case, your personal experience, looking back, why do you think the two losses were grieved in a different way?
My quick answer is relationships. I often, in telling my story in an elevator pitch, I often say that I had two physical deaths of father figures in my life, but it was 4 relationships. And with each of, when I think of my biological father, I grieved not only his physical death, but the relationship that we had and the relationship that I always wanted with him. And then with Warren, my stepfather, in addition to the loss of him and his being, I grieved the relationship we had, and then the relationship that I wished, somewhat kind of a little bit of a regret type experience. I wished I would have been more open to having with him. Mm-hmm. My stepfather was available to me, and I can't say I was the most available emotionally. I was the most available to him. Mm-hmm. So the dynamics of the relationships, I feel like, help us understand that in losing someone special to us, the grief itself, the grieving process for this type of loss is unique too. Mm.
I'm glad the way you described it, because the pivotal point is the kind of relationship that you have. And I would say exactly the same thing to grieving parents who their loss is at the same time. Their loss is the same person, their child or their baby. And I say to them, the relationship is what determines the kind of loss that you have. I say the relationship that you have with your child, but also the relationship that you have inside of you with grief. And so that determines, the kind of loss that is experienced. So you mentioned a little bit how you grieved the loss of your stepdad, Warren. And you gleaned a little bit, but I didn't get enough of a picture. How did you deal with grief and loss early on when your father, so your first significant loss, I must assume, how did you deal with that at the beginning when you were in your early 20s?
Being in my program for psychology, furthering my education, I relied more on my classmates, who I would also call friends. We would spend time processing, and at that time in my life, I was deepening a relationship with my significant other at the time, who's now my wife, and she was, to be cliche, she was an angel in my life. She's a special person who has empathy and understands how to hold space for feelings. And so I felt very comfortable and safe with her. And we would do some rituals. We would do some ceremonies. And she would listen if I needed to talk. I wasn't much of a talker back then. And so it was rare for me to open up and say as much as I would, but there was something special about her that I definitely felt as comfortable as I could be in order to to put words and voice and what was, going on in the complicated inside parts of Reid.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, Reid, I'm so glad that I have a man sitting across me, because there's more women that are guests on the podcast, but also if you talk about Reid at that time, who wasn't very verbally sharing as much as maybe you do now, would you say that talking about the loss was imperative, or were there other ways that you might remember that you processed your grief as a man, as a more introvert man, as you self-described yourself? What would you say were the ways that you experienced grief?
Well, being less of a man and thinking more of being a highly sensitive person, I did feel it's really challenging to put words to articulate it. It's a sensation at times. It's almost like, like if people refer to feeling physical pains, tummy aches or heartburn or something, like I can feel something in my body in a certain way, and understand that it's not permanent. It's something that is trying to get my attention. And in that getting my attention, there's a physical sensation. And so it's almost like I show up as my own nurturer to it, care for it, welcome it, hold it, metaphorically hold it. And in that feeling, like I get some clarity in my mind, or I get some, the feeling, the sensation moves through me. And then I get to a point where I say, okay, I feel better. I'm okay again, until the next time. Something like that. Coming back to your question in regards to being a man, I will speak to some gender stereotypes that that exist in the culture that I grew up in. There is some truth to these. And so in the culture I grew up in, Midwestern, Northern United States, there's a lot of culture, expectations that men don't express feelings. And now I know it's not only to that area of the world. There's many areas of the world that the male gender, it's somehow not okay to express emotions. And so there's definitely an internalization of things. And that internalization of things, it's almost like kind of a default. I don't know if this is human nature or there's science behind this, but there's a default to kind of go up into the intellect, and maybe that's a form of self-control. Maybe that's a form of safety for oneself, a sense of protection. I actually don't know. But it does kind of happen without thinking about it, to intellectualize things and do some of what I know a lot of psychologists call armoring, like kind of tensing up your body and trying to be tough, and the stereotypical masculine sense, get angry. If there's any emotion to express, it's the anger. But in my experience, Natalie, I think as a male, usually that anger is really more of a surface emotion, and there's a lot of pain, sadness, sorrow, well beneath that.
Looking back, would you say that, you mentioned you studied transpersonal psychology. Were there like resources or insight from what you had learned at the time that helped you or that supported your grief?
Yes, but not in the way one may think. So, so the
Enlighten
word
us.
that comes to mind is bypass. I
Okay.
actually, when I was in school and I was in this program, I did not have a pleasant experience. And I was watching people around me um, speak to their own personal evolutions. And at the same time, I did have some judgments as far as what practices were being used or what was being used to help people achieve these higher states of consciousness. I'll share a quick story. In my second year of school, there was a tragedy that happened. A classmate. This is a small program, so each year 20 students were allowed or were accepted, and so we had cohorts, and we got to know our classmates
Yeah.
very intimately, intellectually intimately. There's a lot of group process in this experience, and my second year, one of the new students, he actually took his own life too, and it was a very devastating and tragic event, and I felt the only word I can think of is somehow I felt connected and somewhat responsible for his death because 2 nights before he took his life, I was on the phone with him and he couldn't even formulate full sentences. And I never took it as a warning sign.
Mm-hmm.
And so I missed that. So I definitely felt some guilt and regret in processing his loss. But the point I was trying to make is that when there was a memorial for John, the friend who took his life, and at that memorial, I was angry and I was honestly frustrated because the words being spoken in honor and in memory of John were not addressing the trauma that had been experienced or addressing the pain of loss. There, it did not feel like this experience, this event had space for people to mourn. It was more of like, we only speak of joy here. And when I said bypass in response to your question, that's my example for like these. It's critical to understand that there is appropriate time for sorrow and there is appropriate time for sadness. And I just think that I don't know. I'm starting to get philosophical, so help me track back to staying in the conversation with you. But I really do believe that we need to not stay. We need more spaces available for people to be able to speak to what's really painful and to be able to speak to what our struggles are, to understand that these are real, and they're not just things happening in our head that create complications in life outside of our brains.
Mm-hmm. I'm lingering with what you just said about we need more spaces for people to be expressing what is hard for them and to be okay with it being hard. And the thought that comes up for me is in relation to working with trauma, where we use the word or some of the tools that are helping someone regulate. And I just had a conversation the other day about the differences in regulation, where as sometimes something can be regulated down to numb it out, to not wanting to feel it. And sometimes regulation can help to manage the system to not be overwhelmed with what is at stake, to be building resilience in holding the pain, or to have the resources to be able with what is. That's just something that popped into my mind when you were speaking. I don't know if it relates to you or to anyone listening here. And I think it's absolutely pivotal that we make space for people to be with what is. And there the question is for me, as well with my clients, as well as with anyone that I speak to, is where is grief natural and the space and the time is right for grief, and where does it become complicated and where does it become prolonged? And I mean, I know you have background with that as well, with your studies and with what you offer with where you are today. Do you have an answer to that? Do you have an insight, or what is your opinion?
I think there's a lot of gray area. I honestly do. It's such a great question, and it really creates an invitation for me to reflect on, because I don't think there's a clear answer really from anybody. It really depends on the person, and what their hope or what their intention is. If they know that grief is really impacting their life, they're uncomfortable with how that impact is happening. And also, they recognize that they could use extra support right now. That touches my heart when people reach out to me and say, I know I need the extra support right now. I sometimes think of it as an act of courage, an act of bravery, but at the same time, it's somebody being extremely honest with themselves. And that's what really matters to me the most, that we really be honest with ourselves and understand that, like, we don't have a dark night and we don't have a clear day. There's sometimes clouds, there's sometimes storms, there's a lot of gray area in between what we, try to, I don't know if it's natural either, but sometimes what people hope would be like a major distinction between one thing or the other, like for example, I see a lot of people in the helping profession of grief support. They speak to from grief to gratitude. And that's a little bit of, that sets me off a little bit, because I'm like, I don't know if gratitude is the answer. I don't know if one is grieving, we say, okay, if this is where we are today, I'm grieving. Well, where do I want to be? I don't know if many people who actually are in the throes of their grief say, I want to get to a place of gratitude. And so, like, these distinctions get created, and yet I just think it's like, it's as simple as like, I just want to feel better and I want to feel like I can function. I think these people that are honest with themselves understand that. I like the word journey. I think journey resonates with you also. And they understand that, as they wake up each day and they do their activities and they have major milestones in their life moving forward, there will be moments of missing, longing, remembering, honoring, a whole range of different experiences for someone that they've grieved and continue to grieve at times. And I feel like I went off on a whole tangent, but at the same time, I feel like it's just important in our conversation now, in reflecting on. Quite honestly, I actually don't remember your question.
No, but I liked where you went with it. First of all, the pictures that you drew about the dark night and the bright day, and that there is not just either or. And I think as human beings, we sort of hold ourselves into categories or into places where we can sort things or understand things. But the way you drew that, or you exemplified that, there's not just this or that. And And the question was about when does grief become complicated or prolonged? And I mean, yes, there is the background of the DSM-4, but we don't go into technical things. And there's reasons why these words are used as opposed to just saying something else. There's reasons, but not to get too technical. But I think the picture is good to say, well, there is this place where we want to be in life, maybe after loss, where we want to say whatever that is personally. Today, someone said to me, and he used the word, I want to be at peace around it. And I don't really know how that's going to look like. And sort of that lingers in my head about what does it mean to be at peace with it? So that these were his words. So I don't want to say that this is what it is for everyone, but I liked it, and I took it with me on my drive back from where I met this person, and I thought, okay, that's interesting. Like in relation to my mother's suicide, if there were peace around the fact, what would that look like? And would it be allowing in that peace to have some occurrences of unpeace? So maybe me still being, why did you do that? And things like that. So I think it's an interesting thought to go with, where do we want to go with our grief? And I think for me, in the grief helping society or place where we are, but as well with the grievers, to me, I cringe a little bit when I hear sentences like, something like it never gets easier, or grief is a life sentence. That to me, I cringe, because I'm like, that sets people up for a really hard rest of their life after they lost someone significant. And my personal experience is not that it's a life sentence, nor that it is always equally hard. It has changed. And in my case, I have 12 years of experience. This is my personal experience. I'm not saying anyone else needs to be experiencing the same way, but it has obviously changed.
I'm on board with that. Yes. And thank you for restating your question, because actually in response to some of your thoughts and reflections, I also think I subscribe to the belief that all grief is complicated because of what you just said. It changes. Mm-hmm. So I don't buy into that. Like if a specific protocol can be followed, well, one is going to achieve their goals, whatever their grief-related goals are. I do think the things change and the dynamics change. And I'll actually, in grieving the loss of my biological father, there was a lot of guilt involved, especially the dynamics of the relationships that we had. I remember getting to a point, and this took me quite a long time, Natalie. I perhaps, at the time of our recording, it's been 16 or 17 years since my dad died. I don't know, maybe after 8 or 9 years, I got to a point where I said to myself, I need to start doing some reframing. And what that means to me is like, I need to change some of, the things I'm saying to myself in my own head. And what I needed to change was that I needed to start to help myself understand that the memories of me and my father weren't always negative. Mm-hmm. There were positive memories too. Because I kind of have this story of like, a Vietnam vet who only identified as being a Vietnam vet, who was a victim, exposed to Agent Orange, was an alcoholic, and was emotionally unavailable to any of his children or his significant others. And so, I just had this perception that these things were painful and negative. And I was like, that is true. It happened. And at the same time, there was some joys, my dad had a quirky sense of humor, and there were things that really cracked me up. And I'm like, okay, can I start remembering some of these things?
Mm-hmm.
Or, can I include these in my memories? And that really changed, that has changed things with my dad, as like, I continue to hold some kind of relationship with him, even though he's no longer physically here. Mm-hmm. And so that, to me, that's not easy and it's not simple. So I'm sure there could be debates about it, but I do think that almost all grief is complicated.
Yeah, I like that. It got me thinking into where so many people are trying to follow recipe, or trying to find out how long will I be grieving, when will this stop. I mean, these are the people that I'm asked, the things that I'm asked every time. How long will this pain be that strong? And yes, I agree completely with you. There is no template that we can give to clients. And that's why, I mean, I love my work as individual, and I say that to clients, but people still want to have sort of the steps that I need to take to get out of this dark hole, or however they're describing it. And so I recently had a conversation about how the memory works of the things we remember, what we like to remember, what we don't like to remember, in the same way as the missing of what we don't have. So future-paced grief is always most often related to the good things we miss. We do not sort of future-pace bad teenage behavior that we're missing. So in my case with my daughter, so my daughters were twins, or are twins, and my younger daughter died. So in the missing of the sibling, or the twin relationship, I do not imagine my daughter who died as the annoying teenager that my other daughter is, or sometimes is challenging. I do not remember, okay, I'm going to miss that. I often just think, how would that be like if those two young budding teenagers would talk to each other? But it's the thing about what we choose to future pace in our grief, and how we take memory into that. So I found it fascinating how you reframe that, as that's an amazing resource to have, to remember what are the things that I want to do. And the thing with memory that I probably have said on this podcast before, the thing that amazed me so much when I've learned about memory is that memory is nothing fixed. Memory is something that changes, like the document that you take from your hard drive and you add something, then the memory is forever changed with that addition. And so people tell you something about your grief, and it somehow gets interwoven with what you already know about your story. And you can't just simply say, no, I don't want to remember that, because it's sort of, it gets into your memory with that. And I've probably told this story many times, but there's one thing that exemplifies that. When somewhere on a talk or on a podcast or on a course, I said about the honor I felt when I held my daughter as she passed. And one of the participants said to me, I never saw it as an honor. I always saw it as a burden. And so by me saying that I felt it as an honor, not telling her she should, but she took it on and she said, interesting. There's a pivoting there. Could it be maybe partly also an honor? And so that is fascinating for me in terms of looking at what and how do we grieve? What do we memorialize? How do we future pace the missing? What do we put in there? Just a good relationship? Or also the challenging relationship? Like with my mother, I do not have the challenges of her getting old, because she simply died when she was 69. So that is never going to be an 80-year-old woman like my dad now is. It's never going to have those challenges of anything that is related to that, dementia or anything. If you were to look back at what we shared and how you experienced your life with all those experiences, how would you say have your losses and maybe the associated trauma, how have they shaped you and your life?
The first thing that comes to mind, I would say, is that they've helped me be more comfortable in knowing that I am a complicated person. and that's the truth. I feel like I've embraced it as a part of who Reid is, in addition to like, oh gosh, just my quirks, wanting to people please and stuff like that. And knowing that this big heart inside this chest of mine, like, needs to serve a purpose. Okay, well, can I still be myself in that serving of a purpose? And so that's where everything goes towards. It's like, oh, okay, I can laugh and embrace the whole complicated mess, going on inside this skin suit here, and be okay with it, because there were times earlier in my life I was not okay with it. And I really do believe that my losses and how I've processed these losses and just learned to be and understood to be okay, that it's more than a process, it's a journey, has kind of shaped who I am now.
Mm. And obviously they shaped you to offer the kind of support that you offer to other people. Do you want to say something about that? Do you want to describe what it is that you offer?
Actually, this is what I want to say, because I loved when you spoke to how you mentioned, I can't remember if you said liked or loved, but enjoy working with people individually, because of the uniqueness of everybody's grief experience and how they may have their perceptions of what could be negative, positive, or somewhere in between. I couldn't agree with you more. And it's almost like ironic for me to say what I'm about to say is like, I ended up creating a product, a technology tool that could be available to everyone. And when I first was dabbling with this idea of making a grief support app, I said to myself, it's impossible because everybody's journey is unique. And I'm like, I'm not going to be able to, provide the best service I possibly can by creating an app when I don't know who is going to use it. And I don't want to do too much projecting on them so that, they think they can fit their grief into some kind of box that a protocol will help shape and form. And then it finally hit me, Natalie, is that I'm like, the best thing I can do is share short stories and share wisdom that has been shared by others that helps provide perspective. And so that's what I would say as far as, in my grief journey, I've been in support groups, I've worked with counselors, and they've been fantastic. And I thought, what happens on those days when you're not talking to anyone in your group and you're not talking to your therapist or counselor? What do? And things have changed a bit now, because we do have beautiful podcasts like yours that offer a great conversation and something to reflect on and gain that perspective. But at that time I said, okay, I really need to make something that can provide daily support. And that's really the whole intention with the Grief Refuge app. And so long-winded answer to your question, but with Grief Refuge and its online community that it's built, it's really been the development of a tool, a mobile application to help people who want to grieve perhaps more in their own privacy, gain some perspective by reflecting on some of the things shared on the app.
Great. Yeah, it sounds like we have a similar purpose, different avenue. So all those links are going to be in the show notes for people to want to check out Reid's Grief app. Shall we finish it up with the rapid fire questions?
Okay, I'm sweating, but yes, I'm ready.
So grieving and trauma means?
It's a part of life.
And healing means?
You can hurt, you can love, and it's all okay.
And what have you learned about yourself in the light of loss and trauma?
In addition to what I've shared in our conversation, I've learned that as a helping professional in this line of work, and I'm saying this to you too, Natalie, we may never know the extent of how much people may find what we do supportive.
That's true. Yeah. So what would be one thing you wish people knew about loss and trauma?
There's no definitive answers.
And what would be one specific thing that has changed in your life since your loss and trauma that you wouldn't want to miss?
Sadly, my mom and my relationship has really bonded and gotten closer amidst of the losses of people in our lives.
Yeah, it's never something that we would exchange for the losses we had, but it's always something that comes that might have otherwise never come. Well, thank you so much, Reid, for the time and for your sharing. It was a rich conversation, which I really enjoyed with where we went.
As did I. Thank you, Natalie.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.